Welcome to Denver Parks and Recreation at Home. My name is Josh, and this is Green Camels, the water storage plants. Yes, I am talking about succulents, as you can see. These are a really popular plant to garden right now. I know we all have a little more time at home lately, and they are incredibly hardy plants. And today, I want to show you a little bit about how to propagate, how to plant, and how to care for them. There's a really great variety of succulent plants. They can be some of the ones we commonly see outdoors here in Colorado, from the 15-foot tall blooms of the century plant, that's one of the agaves, to all the way down to these little tiny guys. One of the really great things about succulents, and the reason they are the topic of this program, is how easy it is to care for them, especially here in Colorado, where we have a lot of sun and it's a pretty dry climate too. That is exactly what these plants want. If you can give them some nice porous, well-draining soil, some bright light, and some restraint. Because you know what? They can go for years. Literally, I've had an aloe plant that I forgot to water for over a year once, and it's still going strong. It's 10 years old now. But if you water them too often, that is their weakness. They will really suffer from root rot, and then you'll lose your succulent pretty quickly. So if you have restraint, you're gonna do great. Here in Colorado, some of the larger varieties you might find out on a hike or simply see growing in gardens around your house are the Yucca, the prickly pear cactus, also known as nopales, and, as I said earlier, the century plant. That's one of those agave plants. The smaller ones, like these, come in a really tremendous variety, and they come from all over the world. Here I have a calancho and a key lime pie succulent. These are coming from South Africa and Madagascar, respectively. I have a couple of echeveria and this here cold hardy cactus. And these are coming from Mexico and Central America. I've also got a couple of aloe plants and some really fun hybrids, like this is a dolphin succulent, a hybrid of one of the pea ones and the banana succulents. It's pretty cool. And here I have a watch chain. So there's a lot of variety here, and I've chosen some of these because they all have similar watering preferences. They're all gonna want, just like most succulents, they're all gonna want that really nice, porous, well-draining soil, and we're gonna be kind of putting some together with sand, some small rocks, and some actual soil, like some more organic soil that you might find in your typical potting mix. And I chose some of these for their variety and height as we arrange them in these planters. And others, like this one, are really great examples of where you can see what are called aerial roots. With a fairly basic structure for most of the year when they're not flowering, the other key feature that I want to show you on these succulents are their roots. So they all have those below ground roots that we're very familiar with, but some of the succulents, especially these two on this table here, have what are called aerial roots. This is a well-known cactus called the Christmas cactus because it blooms typically around the holidays every year. And what we're looking at are the aerial roots. So we have these small roots, these little brown strings that are popping out between the segments. And when you want to propagate this, you can pinch or twist off just below the root so that you have some exposed to put into soil or into water until they can grow longer and are ready to be planted again. Here are some really great examples of those aerial roots. You can see it looks like there's all sorts of hairs kind of growing off of the trunk of this succulent plant. Okay. Here I have one of those segments on the cactus. And one thing that you may or may not know is that on a cactus, the needles are actually highly adapted leaves. They do all their gas transportation and everything else that a normal leaf does right there in the needle. And under the microscope, we can take a close look. So as you might have noticed by the way I was handling them, these white needles on this cactus are actually surprisingly soft, and they look really, really cool under the microscope. If you'd like to see one of the spikier rather, needles, let's take a look at that. All the way to its insertion. And so you can see that is coming right out of the center of one of those little stars of the white needles. That's really cool. Let me show you a few more plants under the microscope. The next one I want to show you is part of that aloe plant and what it looks like on the inside with that kind of gel structure. So if I set this down and hold the microscope close to it, we're going to be able to see some of those supersized cells that are holding the water. One of the fun things about these aloe plants, and I know this one is not an aloe vera, but similar to the aloe vera, is it actually has some fairly sharp spikes on the side. This is a plant that is great for healing burns, but you do want to watch out when you're handling it and getting ready to tear it open or peel it back for that inside layer. When I was talking about those aerial roots, it may have been hard to see on the camera from further away, but luckily I have this microscope here hooked up through the USB port of my laptop, and I want to take a look at those aerial roots on this plant right here. So this is what I was talking about, where when these start to develop, you know that this is a prime candidate for propagation. Here I'm using the microscope with the USB port hooked up to my laptop to take a look at the new growth from where I took a cutting about 2 weeks ago. This is what has already started to develop on the end of the stem. So we've got some aerial roots and we're going to learn how to propagate. That is to kind of grow new plants from old ones. You can do that from a seed, or as we'll see here, you can actually just take a cutting off of off of any of these, and you can do a dry propagation or a wet one where we actually put it into water until the roots grow, or if we put it directly into soil, and that's going to allow us to grow whole new plants. So one thing that makes all of these plants succulents are their leaves and that ability to store water in them. In order to do that, they have a few really great adaptations. The surface of them, a lot of them they're all going to feel a lot tougher. Some have some fine hairs that can feel soft, but underneath they've got kind of a leathery feel to them. And when you look at them on the bottom with a magnifying glass or a microscope, you'll see that there are a lot fewer of the stomata. Those are those little holes you'll find on the bottom of most leaves. Well, on the bottom of most terrestrial leaves, on the top of aquatic leaves, and that's where the gas exchange is occurring, where they're pulling in that carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, and also the transpiration of water. If we break a leaf open, like with this aloe plant here, we'll see this gel structure inside. Their cells of the plant itself, of the leaf itself, can hold up to 90% water, whereas most of our cells in our human body are holding maybe 70% water. That gel inside of the aloe vera plant has some really cool properties. It is anti-inflammatory and it's antibacterial. Together, that makes a really great treatment for first and second degree burns. It can also have a nice cooling sensation as you're using it. I learned that firsthand myself when I was a small kid and I burned myself on my grandma's curling iron, and I was just amazed that when I cried out in pain from that happening, she was there in a flash and just reached over right next to the curling iron and tore off a chunk of an aloe plant sitting there and was able to apply it right on the burn, and almost immediately I could already feel how much it helped. It is important to note, however, that while almost all succulents will have this kind of jelly structure inside, they aren't all good for our skin. In fact, a lot of them can be pretty irritating and cause rashes if you got that on your skin. All succulents are pretty tolerant to and often even grow better in direct sunlight. If you are bringing a new plant that you've just taken home, maybe from the inside of a gardening store, and you want to put that outside during late spring, summer, or early fall, then you'll want to take about 10 to 14 days while doing so and start it off in the shade, but then steadily move it out until it can be in full sun. It's going to thrive. And in fact, if you do this, it might even start to flower better when it is time for it to flower later on in the year. It is important to get your succulents inside for the winter though. And by winter, I don't necessarily mean, the winter solstice. I mean before the first frost. Because with all of that extra water inside of their leaves and other structures above ground, if it freezes, it can expand a lot and damage the plant. So you'll want to bring your succulents in and find a nice sunny window to put them in before the first freeze of the year, and you don't want to put them back outside until after the last freeze of the year. And I know how unpredictable that can be here in Colorado. So why propagate? You might want to just get free new plants. That's one of the most popular reasons. It can also be good for the health of the plants. If they're starting to outgrow their container and you don't want to move it to a new container yet, or if you just want to be able to give a cutting to some of your dear plants that maybe one of your house guests admired, you can actually take that and you can place that cutting. This works really well for the leggier or the plants with stems. And you can take that cutting, place it in water, and in about 2 to 6 weeks, you can have some really great roots start to appear. So I took a cutting from this plant right here, the dolphin plant, and this is about 4 weeks worth of growth in this water. And what you find are these really great new roots. There's one coming off the end there, a couple here. And when they reach that length, you know that you've got a much better chance of survival when you replant that into a new potter. Another example, and this is one that had a really woody stem. And so when you take it off, you don't actually see any roots growing. You just kind of cut right at one of the branching points on this plant. And once it was placed in water, it started to develop all these long roots just popping out along its length. So when you go to replant it, you'll make sure that those are covered in the soil and you're going to be good to go. You'll want to make sure that you plant within 2 to 6 weeks after those roots form on your plant in the water for water propagation. If not, you run the risk of that root rot happening and you could lose the whole section that you've cut off. Usually you'll do wet propagation for most plants to have more success with those larger roots, allowing the plant to really take hold and develop quickly. Some though, like this Christmas cactus, allow for dry propagation. All you do is twist off the leaf just below one of those aerial roots and put it in some dry, well-draining soil and add some water. And that should actually, these plants, they can just take off even a single leaf. As I said earlier, succulents are very hardy plants and they are just great to put anywhere you want in your house as long as you have a pretty good source of light. With that in mind, you have lots of options for how to plant them. You can put them hanging up in planters up in the air. You can put them into wooden bowls like this one here. And by the way, this is a great example of how quickly these succulents can grow and how seasonally. This particular plant is about 6 months old. When I got it, it was very small. It was maybe that large around in terms of fanning out from its center when I placed it in this bowl. That was back in February. For the first 2 months, I don't know if it even reached the rim of the bowl. But then within April, suddenly it was hanging down to the bottom of the bowl, and just in the past couple months after that, you can see what's happened. So these plants grow very seasonally. In the summer, you'll actually be able to give them more water. If you would like to, you can give them some fertilizer, maybe 2 to 3 times throughout the summer at most. But what's really important is that come winter time, even though it's indoors and you may try to keep a fairly consistent temperature, you'll still want to treat it as if it were in winter. it doesn't have the same conditions year round. That means that you're going to be reducing how much you water it. Maybe go from once a week down to once every 2 to 3 weeks. And you're definitely not going to want to add any nitrogen. The excess nitrogen or other types of fertilizers can actually encourage it to kind of get some root rot along with that water. They want to go dormant in the winter, and it's important that you let them, not only for their ability to live, but if you do this correctly, then you'll also end up with a lot better blooming flowers when they do flower. Another option from this wooden bowl, and especially if you're starting out with one of your first succulents, is keeping that drainage in mind. So a very popular one would be a terracotta potter, because that all has the hole in the bottom and with the dish underneath to collect it, and the material itself really helps contribute to that water drainage. Alternatively, you could go for one of these more decorative terrariums. And I like to go with a clear one because that also lets you see the substrate all the way through. And so you have a better idea of when to water your succulent and when to maybe hold off for another week, another 2 weeks. If you don't have a transparent planter, then one nice trick you can use is to actually stick your finger up to the first knuckle into the soil, and it should feel totally dry before you water it again. If it's not yet dry, it's not yet time to water. When setting up a new terrarium, like one of these, we're gonna work from the bottom up with drainage in mind. So, I have a few different materials that we're gonna be able to use. Ideally, you're gonna be able to find a cactus mix, is what they're most commonly known as, but a soil that has mixed in inorganic substrate. That means it has some sand or some gravel mixed into the soil, and the soil itself is better able to not hang on to the water that you might want for other types of plants. Unfortunately, they were sold out of that, but I have some potting mix right here. And what we're gonna do is take it and add in some sand and some gravel, both for decoration and because what it does is create a really well draining layer. First off, I'm gonna get some sand. You can get whatever kind you want from wherever you want, whatever color. I think that it looks really nice to use a black sand like this one. One of my favorite places in the world is Iceland, and I loved all those black sand beaches from all that volcanic rock that's been pulverized. So that's what I'm gonna use. To fill our terrarium here, I'm gonna start with a layer of sand on the bottom, and then I will do a layer of gravel or small river rock. And after that, I'm gonna do a layer of soil, but I'm gonna do that at the same time as I start to place my succulents wherever I would like to arrange them. And that way we can help them stand up as we're filling in the soil around. It can be really useful to find a nice little trowel like this one, or you can just use a spoon. So I will fill the sand in just for maybe the bottom inch or so of this terrarium. After we've added our inch or so of sand, I'm now gonna add in the river rocks, or any kind of small gravel will work. What we're going for here is, again, that drainage. These plants are so hardy in terms of drought, but wow, they can die quickly if they get too wet and allow their roots to rot. So for this, I'm gonna take a small handful. And here I'm just going to try to cover that layer of sand. It doesn't need to be particularly deep. For our third and final layer, we're gonna add in the soil at the same time as we take our plants and carefully kind of open up potentially compacted soil that they came in and help integrate it into this topsoil layer. Once again, It would be best if you can find a cactus mix soil, one that's going to be a better choice for your succulents, but this will work, especially considering the steps we've already taken beneath. Next up, I'm going to take one of our aloe plants. Here we have a Park Avenue variety, and as you can see, this one has been allowed to sit in its pot for a lot longer, and it's kind of outgrown its container. These roots have gotten pretty large and they've really wrapped around inside, so I want to take care not to damage the roots. I'm going to just kind of very carefully give it a little bit of compression to help loosen the soil a tiny bit, and then I'm going to place it in here, and I will add in more soil around once we have our third plant inside. For our third plant, I'm going to put on a little protection. I'm going to put on a pair of gloves because this is a very spiky cactus. Here we have a cold, hardy cactus. This one is native to central Mexico. And I'm going to place it right in front in our little terrarium. So, in order to get something this size, and with 2 terrariums to fill, I'm going to see if I'm going to be able to break it up without causing too much damage to the underlying root structure. There we go. And we're in luck. This one must have been put in the pot fairly recently. The roots are well developed throughout, but I think we're going to be able to separate it without too much harm. So you'll start at the bottom where they're loosest and just kind of take your time. Start to loosen it up. See where it pulls apart on its own. You're going to feel certain paths of least resistance as I am kind of pushing up in the center here and trying to find a way to get a nice small segment of these cacti split apart so that we can place them into our terrarium. All right, now that we have our cactus in, I'm going to go for our 4th and final plant in this terrarium, and that is going to be a watch chain succulent from Africa. So we're going to do a similar process as we did with the cactus, where I'm going to pull it out of the pot, and I'm going to start at the bottom where the soil is loosest, and I'm going to start to break it apart really carefully, following the path of least resistance where the roots aren't too grouped together to avoid over-damaging them. And we'll find a segment that we think will fit inside of the terrarium, set it in carefully, and then I'm going to go back to my potting soil and add it around the top until it comes up to the level of our plants. Okay. This one's quite dry, so we'll make sure we water these quickly. Once they get into the terrarium, we'll get to that soon. So I'm starting from the bottom, seeing where I think I can get a good narrow segment to come apart. So let me spin it around where you can see what I've got access to on this side. And this segment right here, I could feel was really pulling away without too much difficulty. I'm going to carefully kind of find my way through, not pulling too hard until we get that right there. I'll place this back. Here's our nicely sized segment of the watch chain plant, and I added a little bit more soil in so that it has enough to hold itself up and so it can be supported as I carefully place the roots down into the terrarium. So the next step here is to add a little bit more soil around the base of each of the plants just to help them get more secured inside of the terrarium, and then we will add our water. So I'm going to take some more of this topsoil and my fun little tiny trowel, and we're going to add it very carefully in small amounts so that we can do our best to avoid getting too much soil on top of the succulents that are already in there. The last step in the creation of these terrariums and the first step in caring for our new succulent plants is the watering. So we are going to water them thoroughly, but then wait. So we'll start off with a good watering, and you're going to wait until you can place your finger into the first knuckle and not have it come away wet at all. You don't feel any moisture before you go back and water it again. This past summer, for me, that's usually taken about a week or so between waterings. In the winter, that can get extended. It might be 2, even 3 weeks between waterings for your succulents. One part of caring for your new succulent plants, especially during the winter, is insects. You might find that pests like to come into your house during the winter, and then when they do, they're drawn to your plants that you have in your house. This is pretty common for all house plants, but in the case of succulents, the most likely pests you'll find will be those little gnats that could fly around. In order to prevent that, first, you want to make sure that the topsoil isn't too wet, and that could actually be a good reminder there for your watering habits. But secondly, if you just find that there's a lot buzzing around your plants, what you can do is take a small spray bottle and fill it with at least 70-75% isopropyl alcohol or ethyl, either one, and spritz it really lightly on the soil while trying not to get the leaves of your plants. Go around the plants and try to just target the soil and just do a light layer, light little spritz over the top. And what that will do is it will kill the larvae and the eggs on the top of the soil without harming your plant, and it will evaporate away very shortly. The last thing I'd like to talk about with these succulents is some of their uses. I mentioned earlier how incredible the aloe vera plant is for the treatment of burns because it is anti-inflammatory and antibacterial, but they have other uses too. So for example, I mentioned the prickly pear or the Nepali cactus. Those are edible. They are really delicious, and if you want to try them out, you could even head down. I happen to know there's a number of places along Morrison Road in the Westwood neighborhood here in Denver where you can go try out a Nepali salad or have them mixed into some of your food. The third succulent I'd like to talk about is Yucca, which was sometimes used by Native Americans, including the Cheyenne people, who would take the leaves and pound them out and then be able to use them for weaving into baskets or sandals. Those leaves and the roots themselves also contained saponins, which can be used to make soaps, and those roots can be eaten. They're these really great starchy tubers that are delicious. Thank you for joining us, and good luck with your own terrariums at home.